So I think while we're doing that, it's just obviously a very warm welcome to today's Tipping Points, where we ask the questions that matter about how we balance conservation and development. Hello, everyone. My name is Craig Atherfold, and I have the pleasure of being today's facilitator for the 13th OGRC Tipping Points webinar. Our focus today is really to dive into the holistic management, and of course, what that means, and explore practical applications in Africa. I'm excited to be here with you, and I look forward to a productive and an insightful discussion. Please be aware this session is being recorded and will be available on the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation, that's OGRC, on our YouTube channel. As mentioned, feel free to introduce yourself and engage in the chat box. Don't hesitate to use the chat box for any questions that you have throughout the session. And again, I encourage you to sign up for the OGRC quarterly newsletter to stay informed about future Tipping Points webinar. Allow me to provide a very quick introduction in terms of who I am. I come from a corporate communications background, and I specialize in managing reputation management, particularly reputation campaigns, focusing on B2B and corporate communications. Throughout my career, I've worked across various industries, including financial services, energy, industrial, and the public sector. With more than 25 years of experience, I've become very well versed in navigating media and public scrutiny across my client base. However, my true passion really lies in integrating sustainable development strategies and assisting companies in making a positive impact through ESG messaging and storytelling. Today's webinar will follow a structured format, beginning with a discussion around prepared questions. We'll then transition into an open Q&A session where you can ask the questions. Please feel free to use the chat box to submit your questions. While we're gearing to have this exciting announcement for you, please open your calendars and mark up for the following webinar on grasslands management. This is happening in just 3 months' time on August the 31st. We have highly anticipated session that will bring together renowned experts. So far, panelists confirmed are Dr. Heidi Hawkins and Dr. Duncan Kimavuyu. To ensure you all get updates about this upcoming webinar and other important information, stay tuned to OGRC's social media channels. Well, I'm joined by an esteemed group of panelists here today, and I'm going to run through a quick introduction of who we all are. So we have Allan Savory, Max Mukavisi, and Roland Kroon. Allan is a native of Zimbabwe. He began his career as a research biologist and game ranger. Drawing on his experience, he made groundbreaking discovery about causes of desertification in grassland ecosystem worldwide. As an independent scientist, Allan collaborated with managers across 4 continents to develop regenerative solutions. Holistic management, first introduced in 1984. In 2009, Allan co-founded the Savory Institute, which now encompasses a global network of over 50 hubs. These hubs make up a localized impact through training and supporting practitioners who manage 21 million hectares of land worldwide. We also have Max Mukavisi. He's from Zimbabwe and brings 25 years of cattle industry expertise to the panel. With a background in accounting, Max has undertaken various projects involving rural communities, genetic improvement, training, and product supply traceability. Max has partnered with donor communities, governments, and private sector to empower rural livestock farmers and help them commercialize their operations into conception to consumption principle along holistic practices. Currently, Max serves as the resident director for the Shanganani Holistic Limited. He oversees a ranch of 7,000 cattle under holistic management. The ranch has no internal fencing and allows wildlife to roam freely. Shanganani also conducts research to find solutions for ranchers and smallholder farmers, while also integrating cattle and wildlife on the same property. Really, the ultimate goal is leaving the world in a better place. And last but not least, we're joined by Roland Kroon. Roland's involvement in holistic management spans across 50 years, beginning in Namibia. This journey has instilled in him a profound passion for land and the realization, the need to challenge prevailing norms and land resource management. Roland is an accredited trainer with the Savory Institute and is the lead trainer at Herding Academy in Graafrenet. In addition, Roland has a diverse interest in and resides with his family on the historically managed cattle farm, Excelsior, near Graafrenet. Today's session is going to be very enlightening. It's going to be some great debate. And of course, with these experienced and dedicated panelists, we're in for a great thought-provoking discussion. So quick welcome from the team. I trust you've got a good indication in terms of who will be providing a view today. And I think without further ado, let me dive straight in. And again, these questions were submitted to us on an Eventbrite platform. Allan, jumping straight in from your perspective, the question came through, is Allan's proposed method generally realistic, other than for specific situations? Would you like to start us off?
Okay, thanks for that, Greg. Yes, managing holistically is absolutely universal. There's no situation anywhere that it doesn't apply. To help people see this, every human is making conscious decisions all the time. 1983, working with a large group of scientists, we discovered that all humans make decisions the same way. And the reason and the context for the decision is to meet a need, a desire, or to solve a problem, and that policies are also formed that way. We also discovered that humans produce millions of things, but only actually manage three. We manage humans, our families, ourselves, institutions, economy, and nature. The three things we manage to produce everything that humans do, food, cell phones, music, art, whatever, those three things we manage are indivisible, and they're all are self-organizing and defined as complex, where everything we produce is complicated, too complicated for me, most of it, but not complex. Now, what we discovered is that we cannot reduce this complexity of our cultures, our families, economy, and nature to produce everything. We cannot reduce that to need, desire, or problem without consequences. And those consequences you're seeing in global desertification, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So now what we do is we get people to manage in every situation in a holistic context, a new concept, not in any branch of science, religion, or philosophy, a concept where we tie our lives to our life-supporting environment in the conditions that have to be centuries from now to sustain our descendants, and we now still meet our needs, desires, problems. You'll never change that, but we do so now, opening our minds to all science and doing it in line with a holistic context as the context for the decision, while the reason remains the same. Now, that is applicable from household. I do it in my home. We've got people doing that, to government and government policies. Managing holistically is not about cattle, not about land. It's about managing the entirety of our lives. I hope that helps.
Certainly does, Max. And I think, obviously, Allan, from that perspective, Max, that brings me on to a question from what Allan was saying. And how can we promote healthier ecosystems, healthier meat, addressing food production, wildlife conservation, and of course, being actively engaged in sustainability with rural populations, communities in Southern Africa? When you take a look at wildlife and rangeland management, and you're doing this all under the umbrella of maintaining profitability.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Very interesting question. I think to start off, the first thing I'd like to do is perhaps talk a bit about Shangani Holistic, because it'll answer part of the question before I go on to talk about the actual engagement with rural communities. So, we're a ranch sat here in about the middle of Zimbabwe, part of the Oppenheimer Generations community of companies. with a large staff complement and a varying vegetation, which has some bush encroachment on the one side and open prairie on the other side. Now, if you were to ask anybody out there who we are and what we do, the first thing they'll tell you is that we are a cattle farm. Yes, we do have over 7,500 cattle. We do concentrate on the Nguni, which is a local breed, and we do have our staff manage the farm, and we train them in holistic practices. But along comes wildlife, and we have over 400 elephant, we have eland, we have kudu, we have giraffe, we also have predators in the form of leopards and hyenas, and they're all integrated onto the ranch, and they roam freely. There are no internal fences, and they move around with the cattle. And what we're trying to show, well, apart from being a business, is that we can have wildlife and cattle working together and roaming on the same property. So our staff, as I said, are constantly trained. We're constantly in the field, but a lot of what we do not just for ourselves to keep within our own borders. We do it to disseminate information to other communities, and we work with a lot of communities, not just around our boundaries, but also in other parts of Zimbabwe, hundreds of kilometers away, because we believe ultimately in a peaceful environment where we can all live in harmony with both our livestock and game. So coming to the ecosystem part of it, I think the first thing is, one of the things we've got to do with our smallholder farmers is we've got to ensure that they understand that the cattle that they have, and I will be specific towards cattle, seeing as that is my area where I purport to be an expert, they can manage their cattle and at the same time have wildlife on their properties, but also that they need to understand that their cattle are economic assets. And for any economic asset, you need to have it reach its full potential. And that full potential obviously is in terms of it being as productive as possible. And the way we're going to get around that, or the way we get them to do it, is through holistic practices. Understanding that the better their ecosystem is, the biodiversity on the land, the healthier their cattle will be, the stronger the performance will be, and that should lead to improved profits. Putting wildlife and cattle together, especially in areas of the south, we've got this tendency for our smallholder farmers to grow a lot of maize. And we talk in terms of working with the land instead of making the land work for you. So if you're running cattle using age-old practices, which they have been using for centuries, together with a bit of training and holistic management, they're able to participate in a better manner and get more funds. Instead of growing maize in an area that is not meant for growing maize, where they're pumping it full of fertilizers and achieving no income. When we talk about food production, protein is absolutely necessary, and you find that protein consumption within smallholder farmers is very low, and the greater part of consumption comes from their intake of carbohydrates. And I know, Allan will talk about the land, and I think it's important that we teach our farmers that we must use the right product for the right amount of land. And that's part of the holistic decision-making process. Whilst we advocate for wildlife and cattle to work together and live together, there are a few problems not that we face more so, but that the smallholder farmers face. The first one is the age-old narrative that any use of wildlife outside of a national park or a given hunting quota is poaching. So when you try and educate the rural farmers, they think that wildlife isn't a viable option. And of course, there is a trade-off all the time, as ever, where what's the easiest thing to do? Sometimes it's easy to take inputs from donors or from the government and grow maize, or leave cattle behind. But what we're trying to do is use holistic management to get our smallholder farmers to, one, improve their revenue, and two, improve the environment. And I think at that point, because of some of the questions to follow, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Max. Roland, this sort of leads me into your area, because when you speak about regenerative agriculture, when you speak about regenerative range management, what's that initial step we need to think about when implementing regenerative range management, and also when you put that in the context of capital allocation?
Thank you. Thanks, Craig, and thanks for, it's an honor to be with you. Look, I think when we look at this this journey of holistic management and regenerative management, I often get asked, what's the first step? And the first step is, I guess, as Allan alluded to just now, is that we got to recognize and accept that what we're doing isn't really working. And there's an endless argument about, yeah, but we're doing all the right stuff and we're having some remarkable short-term results. But if we just step back from all this and look at this, despite the best science, the highest level of technology and money that the world has ever seen, as well as these very, very best intentions, we still are, our landscapes are still desertifying faster than ever before. So there's got to be something wrong with the way we're making decisions, as Allan alluded to. And really the way we make decisions is generally, and humans default to a reductionist or mechanistic mindset, which really focuses on solutions. And once you focus on solutions, you tend to run to technology as the answer. And we need to really step back from that. I often get asked, so, you know, what do we have to do, and how big is the step? And I just refer to it as it's the 4 inches of real estate between our ears. That's the size of the step. So we've got to start with a regenerative mindset, and we've got to think about, one way to do it, just as a practical measure, is to sit back, close your eyes, and think about this piece of land that you're managing, or this business you're running, or this organization you're in charge of. Think about it way beyond your lifetime. Think about the impacts that you make now, which may have might have a consequence way beyond our lifetime, which is not profit driven, because it can't be profit driven if it's in a short, in a long-term mindset. It's got to be much more than profit. And I guess that leads me to, Craig, to your second part of the question, which is, yeah, but I don't have the capital. How do I start? So again, we come back to, Max alluded to it just now, holistic management is not about doing different things. It's actually just about doing what we already do differently. So if you're in business if you're running a farming operation, and you sort of in business, you won't need 1 cent of capital to move across regenerative practice, because it's a mindset. So other than your initial, I guess, investment in some knowledge and training, I've yet to see a single place where capital has been a barrier to implementation. If you're genuine about it, and if you understand what holistic management is about, it's principle based. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't come with a recipe. And because of that, you are then capacitated to take your existing environment and context and make holistic management and holistic decisions within that context. It's got absolutely nothing to do with fencing, with grazing systems, or anything like that. So if you equip yourself with the knowledge, you can start tomorrow. You know, people often say to me, well, how many is a herd? I say, well, just more than one. So you can really just start applying these principles. We've got to step away from this operational mindset of we have to do the following. We've got to put in fences, waters, we've got to buy cattle. That's irrelevant. You've got to just get the stuff sorted out in your head. And it's one of the reasons, I guess, why we run into a bit of trouble with commercial farmers and conventional farmers quite a bit, because you keep telling them, guys, you got to spend some time thinking. And there's a old saying which says that most people or everybody should spend at least an hour in nature every day, unless they're very busy, and then they should spend 2 hours in nature. And it's really just to slow you down and make you think about the consequences of your actions and the way you're going about your business. So essentially, if you've got a regenerative mindset, you're pretty much good to go. In fact, sometimes you need less capital than you would do to do so conventionally. For example, I'm busy trying to work with one of the mines in South Africa, where they have a legal responsibility to rehabilitate this land when they're done with it. Their budget is 120 million rand of shareholders' money on 900 hectares to tick a bunch of boxes, and the effort is guaranteed to fail. The rehabilitation exercise is absolutely guaranteed to fail. So we've just done some thumbsuck estimates there, and we could probably do the same work, rehabilitate the land, improve livelihoods, and be regenerative for less than 10% of their capital. So we need to really think about the levels at which this holistic management is used as an intervention. And there are only really two places we can make a difference. The one is the operational level. So that's the human level. That's the guys where we rush to and from work every day. Our actions and decisions we're making are being implemented. But then there's a much bigger one, which I think is really the issue which needs a lot of attention. And Allan alluded to this, and he probably will touch on it now, is that we really need to create a policy framework. We need to develop an enabling environment for holistic management to work. And I talk now about governments, schools, institutions. I work quite closely with a number of game farms. Some of them are corporate farms, and until the executives and the organizational policy is there to create this enabling framework in which the implementation can take place, we're going to keep running into troubles all the time. So the hardest part for me is to create a policy where the people within that organization feel capacitated to try something new. It's not always a straight line. You might have a few wobbles here and there, but you know what we've seen, for example, in during COVID, where the game reserves, the tourism industry absolutely collapsed. Suddenly, we were able to use livestock as a land regeneration tool and generate income, which was a complete complete pariah until the need arose. So yeah, so the thing about holistic management is it's infinitely scalable, it's infinitely flexible, and you can really apply it at whatever level you choose to do so, depending on your context, your environment, your decision-making, your constraints, your resources. Hope that answers it, Craig.
It does, it certainly does. Roland, and I think, Allan, leading into this question around the development of policy framework, I think taking us really sort of back to the basics and how we implement that framework, you know, I think the more importantly, the questions around how rangeland management is currently being practiced across Africa, and what's the status of that?
I'm very familiar with it, obviously, having worked with it for over 60 years in Southern Africa. And the current situation is that there are very few cases where people individually or companies like Oppenheimer are managing holistically. And you've got 3 people in your panel associated with places where management is holistic. So that's the human level. But the other level of scale is policy level that Roland alluded to. So right now, currently, all agriculture in Southern Africa, which is the production of food and fiber from the world's land and waters, all right, all of that, the national parks, the economic policies of Southern Africa, every one of these is reductionist. And the consequences we're seeing in biodiversity loss almost everywhere, including some of the most serious in the national parks, of which there are 30 surrounding my home, where the loss of biodiversity is terrible, and they're leading to desertification and climate change, which obviously is an unintended consequence of a national park. So that is happening. What is happening is, if you look at Southern Africa, much like America, the greatest export annually is just dead eroding soil, going down our rivers and blowing out to sea. We're seeing increasing droughts, floods, desertification, poverty, social breakdown, violence. Now, in all of that, global finance and South African finance is driving environmental destruction. So we have to start managing holistically at scale, at policy, as the only way we know to address that. And we learned that in 1983, as was said earlier. Now, the part of your question about where we go in the future or what happens in the future will be entirely dependent on scale. In other words, policy, because there's only so much that individuals and companies managing ranches, land, anything like that can do, because they can manage the organization, and then through that, they've got to manage their finance, but they're operating in a global and a Southern African environment, economic environment, in which finance is driving environmental destruction. So at the human level, we can only do the best we can, but we're absolutely doomed unless policy level starts to be developed holistically as well. So if, for example, in 10 years' time, nothing has changed, then I'm afraid the prediction is very easy to make that it'll be far worse, because what we're seeing at the moment is that globally and Southern Africa, biodiversity loss, desertification, mega fires in some parts of the world, and climate change are feeding on each other, as happens in nature, and they're spiraling out of control. Now, the only place, science is logical, the only place at which we can break that cycle is not the greenhouse gas level in the atmosphere, it's at the biodiversity level, biodiversity loss, desertification level, where we are suffering so badly over almost all of Southern Africa. So we have to begin putting that right. We have the power to do it now, and hopefully we can get it done. Now, we had the ability to do this in 1983, when the ability to do this and the knowledge to do this was developed when I was commissioned to train 2,000 scientists, economists, academics in the United States in this technology framework we were developing. And that's when we broke through and learned this. So we've had a 40-year delay. I would hate to see another 10 years. I won't be here, but good luck to you guys, because it's going to be worse if we don't change policy the way it's developed.
Allan, leading into that, and just to sort of juxtaposition the scenario, is this considered top of mind among the powers that be? Is this on the top of their radar?
Greg, unfortunately not. As I spoke at the COP26 meeting, I said everybody at this conference, and everybody at the climate conferences, the sustainable development goal conferences, the Davos economic summits, or whatever they call them, everybody is talking about symptoms. Not a single person other than the Savory Institute do I know in the world is talking about the common sense thing that you cannot address a problem without addressing its root cause. So I'm afraid worldwide, people are just in confusion, and they're demanding that world leaders, that means politicians, take action, but they're giving the world leaders no guidance. Just chaos is coming out of every conference. So we need to be collaborating, stopping the blaming. Nobody is to blame for what we didn't know and hadn't discovered till 1983. And we need to all begin collaborating as team humanity and addressing the cause of the problem. And that's what I'm devoting the rest of my life to trying to bring about.
Allan, I think if we can circle back to one of the points that you raised, at one point, can one create overutilization, creating degeneration?
I think you're meaning, or that question came from people meaning the land. What we tried to do is this is way back in the 1960s, when I first discovered that we absolutely had to learn how to run livestock, as there was no other way of breaking that biological diversity loss, desertification problem. And when I worked out that we had to do it with livestock, that's when I adopted the technique of planning that came from the army, 1,000 years of military experience in planning extremely complicated, ever-changing situations in battlefield conditions, developed what is today the holistic plan grazing process. So when we did that, we did the international charter trials that were conducted, but we also ran 2 advanced projects in Zimbabwe, one in high rainfall, one in low. We called them advanced projects because if we'd called them trials and they failed, critics would have jumped on it. And we called them advanced projects because we deliberately tried to cause failure. So what we did, in particularly the one on the Liebig's company in the southern lowveld, is we took the worst land we could find in the whole of the country. And we took 4,000 acres of that. The company gave the cattle everything we needed, the capital, and I pushed it to breaking point, went to a ridiculous stocking rate on essentially just bare ground where we couldn't find a perennial grass in a 100-mile drive, not a single plant. On that bare ground with twigs, leaf fall, weeds to feed cattle, we, in the first year, went to 3 times the stocking rate. Now that theoretically should have failed. It didn't. We just developed solid perennial grassland. The entire thing ran for 8 years. We produced 5 times as much meat per acre as the surrounding control area of 200,000 acres. And that entire project cost $1.80 an acre. So we tried our best to cause failure and couldn't. Now on the Africa Center land where I live half the year, we've gone from, when I bought that land, it's now not mine, I donated it to a trust, but when I bought the land, the man I bought it from was going bust. He had 100 head of cattle. He could have run more if he'd been a better rancher. There were no elephants, no buffalo. Today, we're running about 700 head of cattle as the main tool to reestablish the environment and habitat. And today we are building that up to 1,000 head of cattle. And we're already realizing we're going to have to go to 2,000 head of cattle. And today we can have anywhere up to 300 buffalo, 300 to 500 elephants on some days. So that is just mind-boggling. And we don't know where that's going to go. So that's why we call it a learning site, and we're just keeping learning. So we do not know what the ceiling is when you actually use the holistic plan grazing process. What I have predicted, and I think it's a safe prediction, is that you overshoot the mark, which we couldn't do. All right, if you do, then the cattle will suffer, not the land. The land will keep getting better. And I think this mirrors nature, where we've seen in nature, when populations rose to extraordinarily high levels for whatever reason, we got a mass die-off of animals. The land didn't deteriorate. I think we're going to see a mirroring of nature.
Thanks very much, Allan. Valuable points. I'm going to throw this question across to the three of you. Questions come through in terms of how rangelands can be holistically managed with herbivores and fire. Who would like to take that one?
Well, I think I'm happy to give it a stab. The fire animal debate is quite contentious at times, but if one goes through the holistic management training and the literature and the understanding of it, fire is but a tool. It's one of the tools we have. It's like having your toolbox. We've only got 4 tools. We've got technology, we've got fire, we've got non-disturbance or rest, and we got herbivores or animal impact, also living animals. So in any application, as long as you know what you're trying to achieve and you look at the tools you have, you will then, through the process of selection, which tool is the best for this issue now, not the system, never a system. You apply, you take one of the tools out of the toolbox, you use it towards your context. The guy next door might have a different context, a different desire, a different outcome. So there's no right or wrong. There's no one size fits all. And as much as fire it gets blamed for a lot of damage, it's also become a bit of a crutch for a lot of management. It is just one of those tools we have, and as long as you know the consequences, it fits into your process, what you're trying to achieve. You know what you're trying to achieve. You're addressing the symptom and not you're addressing the root cause and not the symptom of an issue. Then it doesn't really matter whether you use herbivores or you use fire, or you can use them in conjunction. You can use one to create the other. So it's an infinite flexibility of the application of just these 4 tools we have. And And I jokingly tell my children when they go off to go and do something out in the rangeland, I said, guys, for goodness sake, take your whole toolbox, because if you leave one spanner behind, the chances of you needing it out there is probably quite high. And this is exactly the same in our rangeland management. We've got only these tools. It is, you leave those tools, one of those tools out at your peril. And to me, the most important thing with these tools of management is that they must become servants and not masters. The moment the tools become a master, then you're in trouble, because then you become dependent on the use of that tool. So Alan's probably frowning horribly, because that's my view on it.
Really, just to add to that, at the Africa Centre, we use fire. We use fire to make the fire breaks. We tried to use the cattle to make the fire breaks as a tool, spraying with a weak saline solution or the molasses solution. It was too slow in the narrow window of time you have to make fire breaks. So we now use fire to make the fire breaks. And if we had any other reason to use fire, we would do it, just as you've just described very, very well. But what we're also doing now is using the holistic plan grazing to deliberately overgraze, to create the edge effects that we need for wildlife, to get a higher wildlife populations, because traditionally we've always used fire, and fire is rapid oxidation, and we've got to overcome the oxidation problem, and fire exposes soil. So if we use high physical impact of animals and deliberate overgrazing of every grass plant, we develop a solid mat or grass sward. And so we do what we were trying to do with fire, but now without exposing bare soil. So there's nothing in holistic plan grazing that said you should use fencing or you should use anything. I mean, sometimes we run one herd on continuous grazing for months. Why? Because it allows us to run the main herd faster and have a bigger impact on the land. It literally is a planning process. We've never known how to make it fail, as long as you treat it like that. And you said it very well. There is no management system.
Gentlemen, leaning into the points that we've discussed, there's also consideration, I think there's also thought around how can this holistic approach be best implemented when you're looking at communal rangelands?
Can I jump in? I think the first thing is understanding, when we talk about holistic management, the reason why I think we talk about it is we've come a long way from where we used to be. And in the past, many, many years ago, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, the rural pastoralist, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, was probably a holistic practitioner, because they worked with the land. They didn't have, a very small plot of land where they put a maize seed, where they put excess fertilizer so they could get a bigger yield or got inputs from someone. They worked with what they had. So they worked holistically with the land, with their animals, with their crops, with their families. We talk about the three issues of society, environment, and finance. Basically, those were their three tools. With industrialization, obviously, things went to a different level. So I think when you talk about communal farmers, the biggest problem is we're trying to reinvent the wheel or produce a new wheel instead of simply polishing it. Nobody's going to the communities and saying, what did your grandfather used to do? What can we improve on what he did? Instead, what's happening is, in 9 out of 10 cases, we're arriving there and saying, right, guys, you've got to do this with your cattle. You've got to do this with your crops. You can't do this. You can do this. Society, the biggest one is gender and youth. Instead of addressing the whole issue of the family, you've got donors coming in and saying, we're doing youth projects to the detriment of the mother and the father. And at the same time, they're coming in and doing projects for the women to the detriment of the youth and the father. So instead of looking at the whole picture, what's happening is they're segmenting it, and we're pulling people away from what they used to do. I think people have a lot of indigenous knowledge, and you'll find a lot of the indigenous knowledge can tie back very easily to holistic management. So the concept of it being difficult to teach to smallholder farmers is a bit alien, and we've had a few successes in talking to the farmers and getting them to understand the process and understand what it means and that it's a way of life. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah,
But all good-
Max, if I could, sorry, Craig.
Go ahead.
I think, Max, what you're saying is absolutely correct in the sense that, and I mentioned it just now, it's not about doing different things, it's just doing the existing stuff differently. And this is where, and I really liked your mention of what I like to call the NGO mentality, because it tends to come in with a drop-in solution, when in fact one has to step back and say, what do we want to achieve in this communal environment? What are the restrictions? What are the limitations? And then get the human side lined up in terms of developing a holistic context, because ultimately that is the reference point against which all decisions are made. You can't have a organization sitting in Europe creating a outcome for people sitting in the middle of Kenya. You've got to have the people in the middle of Kenya working out what it is that they want to achieve, and then they can go out and seek the assistance they need in the specific areas.
From our perspective, I think Allan, Max, Roland, again, very incredibly valuable contributions. We've now opened up the discussion and take some questions from our audience. So if you haven't posted your questions yet, please do so in the chat box. A few of those questions have come through in the Zoom chat box. And the first one, of course, is from Diego. Diego asks, in developing holistic rangeland management at scale requires policy changes. Could you give us a few concrete examples how these policy changes should look like?
Well, first, you can't, it's not holistic range management. Land is not manageable. That's what we've tried to do for 10,000 years. As I said, land, economy, culture are indivisible. Anybody doubting that has only got to look at Eskimos and Bushmen. They're totally different. They're the same human species, but they're totally different. Their cultures, their whole physical appearance, because they grew up in different environments. Our culture, our land, it's totally indivisible. It really is. That's why the word holistic that came from Smuts. Right? So policy has to be holistic. That's what matters. Now, when it is, it's easier to develop. There is absolutely no conflict, because you start with complete agreement on the holistic context. And when we develop the holistic context with the facilitation, we don't even have compromise between people, because if you compromise, neither party is happy. We keep talking about what is the real value they're expressing, or whatever it is. When we have the holistic context, there is complete agreement amongst people. Now we open our minds to all the things that Roland said it very well earlier. We just do things differently. All the knowledge we need is already available. Now, I've already done this with 35 members of parliament in Zimbabwe and 2 opposing parties about 10 years ago, and they were in complete conflict. Right? Now, once we developed a holistic context, they were in complete unity, and were suddenly no longer 2 political parties that were actually killing each other. At the time, it was really bad. It was suddenly just 35 Zimbabweans working together. By the end of that retreat with them, we had the ideal agricultural policy the world dreams of, and every bit of knowledge we needed was in the room. All that wasn't there was the ability to facilitate people managing this complexity holistically. So that's really all that is needed, is to get one government somewhere to just do it.
Thanks very much, Allan. We've got a next question.
No problem.
We've got a next question that's coming through from Chavot. How do you prevent overgrazing? Nobody plans to overgraze, and yet it still happens. Who would like to take that?
Shall I take that one?
Pleasure.
There are thousands of PhD dissertations and papers. Not one of them even defines overgrazing. Overgrazing was never defined because it's a belief that it's too many animals. That goes back thousands of years to ancient texts where you can see them blaming the shepherds for having too many sheep and causing the deserts. That is the big mistake I made that I talked about in the TED Talk, when as a scientist, I fitted the data to fit the belief, which all scientists do. We had my work peer-reviewed by a committee, and the government went ahead and shot 40,000 elephants. I publicly admitted that was a mistake. Nobody else to this day has admitted it was a serious error, because the situation got worse. And we've been doing that all over the world, decreasing stocking rate, while the situations kept getting worse. A French scientist in the 50s discovered that overgrazing's got nothing to do with animal numbers. It's everything to do with the number of days a plant is exposed to grazing and how long it has for its roots to recover before it's grazed again. And it doesn't matter whether you've got one cow, wildebeest, or buffalo, or 1 million. All that changes is the number of plants overgrazed. The fact of overgrazing is a time factor. That is why when we manage holistically and do the holistic plan grazing, we ensure that we minimize overgrazing of plants. And now we were able to take stocking rate up, as I said earlier, to ridiculous levels, and the land just got better. So it really is an area where we've had tremendous ignorance about what overgrazing even means.
Interesting, Alan.
Craig, sorry, Craig, and I'll just jump in there as well. I think, and it's really critical that Alan's point there, but you hear that he said, you try to minimize overgrazing. You're never going to eliminate it altogether, because there's always going to be a steenbokkie or a springbuck or something left behind. So there's always going to be some overgrazing. But in essence, the holistic plan grazing process is trying to manage complexity. It's trying to bring all these elements in, design the outcome, know where you want to go, understand the complexity you're working with, be able to be agile when conditions change. So if, for example, a plant is growing quickly, it'll reach its recovery point earlier. If it's growing slowly, it's going to need a longer recovery. Now, grazing systems don't allow that. Holistic plan grazing accommodates that. So it goes about building in the flexibility and this continuous learning, and every decision you make is based on a feedback loop. It's information which is coming back from a previous decisions.
I think that kind of leads into the next couple of questions. Evan speaks about the Riet-Spruit Game Reserve, which is just over 5,000 hectares. It's fenced in with endemic grazing and browsing species, obviously, except buffalo. He says they're in a buffer zone due to vet regulations in terms of foot and mouth, etc. So buffalo on the east are considered foot and mouth. Obviously carries, considered are really sort of disease-free. However, we cannot get buffalo in the zone. Similar issues arise with cattle, so grazing pressures, and how can grazing pressures be increased here? In a similar vein, Bruce also speaks about communal grazing along holistic principles, some practical examples in Zambia, some interesting and counterintuitive outcomes. If we had to summarize grazing, Alan, in 2 minutes, what would we say to Kevin and to Bruce?
I battle to understand that question. So I literally would need it explained again. I didn't get what the question was clearly.
Kevin speaks about the Riet-Spruit Game Reserve, where obviously there's just over 5,000 hectares that have been fenced in with endemic grazing, except for buffalo. He says they're in a buffer zone, and due to vet regulations, so buffalo on the east are considered foot and mouth free. I guess so the question really there is, we cannot get buffalo in this zone. Similar issues arise with cattle. So how can the grazing pressures be increased?
Well, I don't even know what grazing pressure means. It's to me, I'm hearing you've got a fenced in game reserve. You've got no buffalo because of foot and mouth disease, so they cannot bring them in. Well, use cattle and just plan the grazing holistically. If you just manage holistically, you'll do it. But what I would be trying to do there is, if you don't have enough animal life with the wildlife there, which is our case at the Africa Center, we have all of the lions, the leopards, the cheetahs, the wild dogs, the elephant, the buffalo, giraffe, we have them all. We don't have enough. So that's why we've had to build up all this cattle herd as the main tool to do what we need to do. So if they can't get the wildlife doing it, then the decision would be, let's bring in cattle. But in the end of the day, we need to look at policies again, because that buffalo foot and mouth policy you're almost certain to find is unsound.
I think that follow-up comment from Kevin says they cannot use cattle to control grazing, so they only have wildlife.
But
Well,
Greg, can I just come in there? You know, it's we tend to we make up these things. We make up these barriers for implementation. We work out why we can't do things instead of why we can. One of the beauties of using holistic planned grazing is because it's a planning process, and you can understand animals as a tool, domestic animals under management as a tool of rangeland management. And we know that, as far as I know, with foot and mouth, it's transmissible by contact. So you know, it's quite simple. You just graze the animals where the buffalo aren't. Go out and scout them and do your grazing plan accordingly. So it's as long as we develop the holistic context around that and say, okay, guys, how are we going to do this? These are the outcomes we want to achieve. These are the tools we have. There is a solution. I'm pretty much can guarantee you that there will be an answer.
Again, probably circles back into an earlier conversation we had around agriculture and biodiversity conservation can be aligned and not negatively impact each other.
Well, if you don't align them, God help humanity, because everything is dependent on agriculture. Without agriculture, you can't have a church, you can't have a choir, you can't have a university, you can't have any business, you can't have an economy, you can't produce a cell phone, you can't produce anything. It's the whole foundation of civilization. And that's why we have to get governments to develop agricultural policy holistically. If we don't, the cities are going to fail. Every business is going to fail. So you have to align them, and at scale, it has to be policy.
I think one of the things, if I could come in there, I think sometimes, and I'm being the complete rebel going out left field, I think some of the problem is why do we always look to government policy to change the way we do things? You know, you've got a government, for argument's sake, consisting of, you know, 100,000 people and a population of 50 million people. Why do you want to wait for those 100,000 people to make a decision? And I'm not talking about political decisions. Please don't get me wrong. I'm talking about basic decisions, livelihoods, etc., etc. You look at what's being done in the world by the millennials, saying that, you know, beef is bad for the world, it's killing us all. We had the Eat Lancet report. We had Bill Gates saying that people should not eat meat and cattle should be diminished. And the world stood up and supported them. And governments put in plans. I think Holland, they were closing down half their farms or something crazy like that. It's about getting the message across to people. And I know it's something we've discussed. It's about how do we get people to understand what we're talking about when we talk holistic management. How do we get, to put it simply, how do we make holistic management sexy? How do we get the millennials to sign up for it? How do we, you know, I can't sit here and wait for government to come up with a holistic policy on agriculture. What I can do is I can work with my board and my shareholders and come up with holistic grazing plans that we can work out here and we can take to the people around us and the people around them and the people around them, and thus let the change happen. You can't expect me to be walking the corridors of power trying to get them to change that policy, because trust me, I mean, Alan's been trying for how many years? It's not going to work. So I think the real question is not how do we change government policy, is how do we make holistic management appeal to the influencers? You know, the millennials who can sit there, a simple thing. I was on a Zoom call with the FAO last year before COP27 discussing a presentation. And they said to the global cattle industry, you have the biggest opportunity ever presented to you. You have 20% of the world's cattle on the African continent. You have COP27 in Egypt. Your agenda should be pushing the smallholder African farmer and how you can improve his lot. Holistic management, one of the answers. But what did they do? They didn't do that. They didn't take that opportunity, and they went and talked about the American beef industry, etc., etc. So we're losing the battle. You've got the easiest solution in the world. How do we get people to see that? And I know I'm rambling on a bit, but that's got to be our starting point.
Not at all.
Craig, if I could comment on that, Max is absolutely right. That's the only known way of change. And I can tell you now, and I'm not giving my opinion, I'm just quoting the social sciences, the research and history, that Max is right. You try and convince more and more people until your institutions change, because all management at scale is institutions. I can't even make this pen. Almost nobody can. It's made by a company. I can't make a toothbrush. Almost nobody can. It's made by a company. Everything we do, including religion, is managed through an institution. So you have to change the institutions. And the way Max is saying is the only known way. And Max, if we look at research, history, and everything else, the minimum time that takes when 2 new discoveries are involved that go against human belief is 200 years. So far, I've been 60 years, so we've got another 140 years to go. I don't think humans have got that time luxury. That's why I'm trying something that's never been done in the world before.
Allan,
Put it at COP26, and I'll keep putting it out. I'm just suggesting we get one government to take a neutral case like national parks, why they're losing biodiversity, contributing to climate change, and have us all just bury the hatchet, stop debating, discussing, arguing, work together, develop a policy, and just see what can be done.
Allan, I think on that note, thank you. Max, Roland, I thank you for your time. There's been insightful questions and insightful conversations. Just a minute or two before we do wrap up. So probably the broader question is, where do we go from here? We still need to instill hope and avoid dwelling solely on the challenges. There certainly is hope out there. Again, I express my gratitude and thanks to Max, to Roland, to Allan for their valuable insights and valuable contribution to this conversation. It really has been insightful. The next Tipping Points webinar is scheduled for June the 22nd. It's coinciding with Youth Month. June 22nd webinar will amplify youth voices, 3 youth voices and priorities on conservation matters. You can register for this webinar by clicking on the link provided in the chat box. Please also remember to sign up for the OGRC quarterly newsletter to stay updated on future events. You can find that link in the chat box too. For those who missed the earlier part of this webinar or wish to revisit it, please note that there is a recording and that will be uploaded to the OGRC YouTube channel and conservation. In addition, there's a summary of this webinar that's also available on the OGRC website. Once again, my sincere thanks to Allan, to Max, to Roland. Thank you for your participation. We look forward to welcoming you and the team to the next Tipping Points webinar. Goodbye for now.